And if the judges will now please introduce themselves.
Okay, hello. My name is Miriam Amar Sadeghi. I serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education. I participated as a student the very first year the program was offered on the bicentennial of the US Constitution, long time ago. And I've spent a large part of my career focused on providing civic education to the people of Iran, where I'm originally from.
And hi, my name is Tandy McConnell. Spent about 20 years as professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina. Then I decided to do something much more interesting and became a high school history teacher, which is what I'm doing now.
All right, Michael Depira. I work for the state of Florida with the Florida Department of Education, and just glad to be here. Nice to see y'all.
Could you all introduce yourselves, please, and also introduce your teacher?
Yes. My name is Ella Maddox. I'm a junior at the Williston Northampton School. I'm Soren Rutherford.
My name is Avi Kacker.
My name is Chris Ludicky.
I'm Nick Desai.
I'm Connor Hagness, and this is our wonderful teacher, Mr. Peter Gunn.
All right. Well, first of all, before we even get started, congratulations for being here. Unit 1, Philosophical and Historical Foundations of the American Political System. The question is the first one, begins with a quote from Benjamin Rush. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times? Please begin.
Actually, hang on 1 second before you begin. All right, there's Anna. I just want to make sure Anna popped back up to see if one of us needs to keep time.
No, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
I knew something was amiss when Ella became the host. So are we good to go?
I believe we are, yes.
All right. Americans sought independence and engaged in constitution making inspired by the long-established principles such as natural rights, republicanism, and constitutionalism. Foremost among these was the principle of consent, direct consent through actual representation. John Adams disagreed with Benjamin Rush's claim that the revolution had yet to occur when he said, "What do we mean by the revolution? The war. That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people. Thus, when Jefferson wrote that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, he was expressing a British idea."
Adams and many Americans believe that Parliament violated the principle of consent expressed in the Petition of Right in the Glorious Revolution when they imposed the Stamp Act. That law provoked a debate over virtual versus actual representation and the division of power between London and colonial capitalists, ultimately prompting the Americans to go to war. They hoped their newly founded governments would be based on direct consent in a federal system. For example, Section 6 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights states that the community have the right of suffrage and cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected.
Even under the Articles of Confederation, the revolutionary ideal of popular sovereignty conquered colonialism. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 asserted that the new states, once admitted to the Union, would receive the same amount of representation in Congress as in the 13 original states, seen in both the Confederate Congress under the Articles and in the Senate under the Constitution.
The main issue with consent in the creation and amending of constitutions is the tension between principal majority rule and the social contract theory. The latter requires unanimous consent, but as the experience under the article showed, such a requirement often impeded pragmatic solutions. In early amending to the Constitution, James Madison witnessed firsthand the struggle in passing amendments. He received 227 suggestions for the first set of amendments, 19 of which he passed on to the Senate, and 12 of those 19 received the necessary 2/3 to send to states for ratification. Of those 12, only 10 were ratified, further displaying the struggle the U.S. faces with amending the Constitution through its supermajority. These attempts by James Madison and others to amend the Articles to include the power to tax faced defeat when Rhode Island refused to go along with the majority. Pragmatism thus triumphed over principle in the new Constitution when the framers made ratification subject to 3/4, 9 states, instead of honoring the principle of unanimous consent. However, even after successful ratifications, Americans discovered how difficult it was to receive a supermajority needed to amend the document. Amendments are ratified through approval by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then sent to state legislatures or conventions, which require 3/4 of the state to ratify.
We acknowledge that the Bill of Rights is the exception that proves the rule. Within 3 years, 10 of 12 proposed amendments were added to the Constitution. However, since then, there have been over 11,000 proposed amendments, yet only 33 have been sent to states by Congress, and of those, 27 were ratified.
Important examples of failed amendments include the Ghost 13th Amendment, the Child Labor Amendment, the DC Statehood Amendment, and the Equal Rights Amendment. 3/4 of the states have ratified the latter, but 3 of these ratifications came after the 7-year deadline was extended. The failure to ratify this amendment highlights the issues with consent, as a simple majority consented, but not the needed supermajority.
The democratic principle of effective representation and racial equality has had a great influence over modern political movements such as Black Lives Matter. African Americans have always been oppressed, and many suffer from poverty and unemployment, making them less likely to vote. Opal Tometi, the co-founder of BLM, says, "I think the two-party system isn't working for us. It hasn't worked for us for generations. Let's be very, very honest about that. And Black Lives Matter is choosing, to an extent, revolution." Supporters of the movement need to disrupt the system and fight for equal representation. Both major political parties have failed to address and rectify the major issues that lead to the failure of voting in Black and Brown communities. Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you. So, as far as consent goes, what do you all think about civil disobedience? Is it a part of establishing consent, pleading for consent? And what about if that disobedience is not civil and it's instead violent? Do you still think it is?
I think that civil disobedience is a fundamental aspect of democracy. Martin Luther King was thrown into Birmingham jail to protest for African American rights.
Right, and to follow up with that, I feel like the recent Capitol riots are an example of where civil disobedience doesn't work. They felt what they were arguing for was essentially the right to be represented, yet the violence that they concurred during their actions essentially led to it being seen as a very bad example of civil disobedience. But whereas Martin Luther King, he preached that violence must not happen due to the fact that it only creates the opposing side to not be able to listen, whereas peaceful protests are the most fundamental aspect to getting your side heard.
In addition, regarding the protests at the Capitol, the people protesting there consented to a democracy in an election, in that whoever wins the election. So their consent was not being violated in the outcome of the election. So their protests were unlawful in that sense as well, and that it was unlawful civil disobedience.
Just finally adding on top of what Avi was saying, the January 6th event that we're talking about, which happened, was obviously a very clear example of civil disobedience. But the issue with that is that what Avi was saying, the people did consent to the fact that when they were voting, they knew that whatever the outcome was, they were consenting to that through voting. So it does actually have a lot to do with the idea of consent.
Let me follow up on that with a totally different kind of question. The Electoral College is widely understood to be a block to popular sovereignty and a way in any tyranny of the majority, and a way to protect and enhance the rights of minorities. Do you believe that we should get rid of the Electoral College, and if so, with what should we replace it?
So I was just going to say that I think it's interesting subject to talk about, because not only is it when you vote, it's not your direct vote that goes towards it, it's the Electoral College vote. So I think in a way, people can argue that it's not as effective as they would like it to be for their representation, because some people, like the past few elections, the popular vote isn't always the outcome of who the president is. So the popular vote among the people may not always be the end result once it goes through the Electoral College. So you could argue there is an argument there that it isn't totally transparent through representation, and not all votes are counted as they would be in a popular majority, the population voting.
Adding on top of what Chris was saying, I think this relates back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think that's really important to talk about, the fact that people, like, that act was super important to the United States history, because people weren't able to, this made it this made people able to be equally represented. And I think the Electoral College system makes it a problem that people aren't able to be represented equally.
To counter argue my colleagues, I would like to say that I think the Electoral College is efficient because I feel like back at the Great Compromise, they decided that each state would receive 2 senators and the representation would be based on the House of Representatives. And essentially the Electoral College embodies that because each state receives the amount of electoral votes based on representation. And I feel like that the Electoral College embodies the representation that was founded at the Great Compromise.
I would like to say that I think it violates consent because in Massachusetts, where we have 11 electoral votes, the majority of the votes would go to one candidate. So if 6 people voted for candidate A and 5 people voted for candidate B, all 11 would go to candidate A.
So what is a more appropriate way with keeping the Electoral College, but dividing up your state's vote? How would you say a more representative way to show consent for your state would be?
I would think that it should be based on the number of votes per candidate per state. So say, for example, in the recent election, if Donald Trump got 3,000 votes and Joe Biden got 5,000 votes, then Joe Biden would receive like 5/8 of the electoral votes and Donald Trump would receive 3/8. Because I feel like you should be able to get the popular vote and electoral vote based on the population.
I think that more states should follow with what Maine and Nebraska do, where depending on who wins the majority, the votes just go to that candidate.
So what is an argument against that? Why wouldn't that be a case across the board then?
I think that an argument against that would be that certain states feel like underrepresented because I think you have to take into account the overwhelming majority of the state. If one state really leans towards one political party, but some don't, I think that the state should be represented as a whole because the election is so big and there's so many states that it's easier to use that to find out the perspective of like one specific region or one specific state.
And gerrymandering could pose an unfair advantage because depending how the lines are drawn, there could be like an overwhelming amount of Democrats in a Republican area, making for like the state to be more Democratic.
Okay, so going in on that, when you're looking at levels of government and the consent of the governed, where would you put the most importance on people giving consent? At local level, state level, federal level? Where do you give the most weight when it comes to consent of the people?
I would give the most consent at a federal level because they're making the overall laws. They're creating what natural rights are. So the state and local government are kind of just a trickle down and find out where to best allocate these natural rights.
I would argue with my colleague. I totally get what he's saying, but I think that it's the most important is at the state level because each state is able to represent what their state needs and how their state functions as opposed to how the United States functions as a whole.
What would the founders say? Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I know we had a minute. How would the founders argue that? Who's more correct in the founders' perspective?
I think that they would agree with the state government because of the creation of state constitutions and the 10th Amendment, which allows for states to like have rights that and make laws that are not limited by Congress.
I feel like it also is a great example of federalism and how if you are effectively represented in your state and actually represented in your state, then your state should be able to advocate for you in the federal government. So I feel like federalism is definitely a big aspect of this.
Time.
Thank you all for your time.
Well, thank you. Miriam, or
Yes.
wrap us up?
Yes, I really enjoyed how well you worked together as a big team and the examples that you brought in. I think that there are times when you could have been more precise or exact with the words that you used. For example, natural rights. Natural rights aren't really something that are legislated. They're something that exists and that the founding fathers considered something that is, they are inalienable, they are from God, they are natural, they're not the work of government. So that's something that sometimes when we speak quickly, even the most prepared and polished of people can say things they don't mean, and that could have been it. But that's all the more reason to think through a little bit some of these concepts before you even get here. But when you're here, when you need to slow down and really think through what you're saying, because when you get one thing wrong, it's easy to then build on that wrong thing, if you know what I mean. So natural rights are foundational. They are a priori, they're before government, they come before the Constitution, they come before any kind of any type of government, even democratic government. And that's I'm not just saying that, that's in the one of the sort of the basic understandings of the American founding.
Thank you so much.
And let me follow up on that. It was a wonderful presentation. The clarity of your original initial presentation was outstanding. And you, with that, you put in just a great deal of a great many specific examples to support your generalized assertions, which is exactly what I asked you to do. You make a generalization, you support it with examples from court cases, from examples of different events. You answer our questions effectively. We ask you guys hard questions because we felt like you're able to deal with those. And by and large, you responded with a great deal of effectiveness. I did notice, however, and again, I'm not going to hesitate to critique you at this point. I asked you about the Electoral College. You told me the ups and downs of it and responded very well. But the part of the question was also, what should we replace it if we're going to? And I don't feel like I got a complete answer on that. But overall, and it's overall that matters, you did an outstanding job. And I'm delighted to have had this conversation with you.
Thank you.
So in your introduction statement, you did say something. I mean, the statement's been said over and over again, but the way you said it and the way you framed it, I think is really great for a larger discussion. The revolution, war in the minds, and it just makes you really think, and it's something to dive deeper into outside of this conversation. So I kind of just highlighted that. I appreciated your opening statement, the laying out of the understanding. It's very clear you understand the relationship between natural rights, republicanism, consent. With that, in the open questioning, what would be, I think, a little bit more to strengthen would be to refer back to some of those principles in your opening written statement. And sometimes on the fly, it's hard to do, but it's like when you write an essay and you want to wrap up like a paragraph, keep going back to what your overall thesis is. And that's why at the end, I asked you, because I think it was Ella and maybe Nick, or Ella and Avi, both gave very good answers to the question. But ultimately, we want to dive down into, like, then what would the founders say, and where is that answer in the founding principles? And then if you want to extrapolate into, this is how I see it changing and evolving over time, I think that would be great. But just remember, we the people and the founders, and bring that into everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Y'all were great.
Yes, wonderful job. Congratulations on participating today. Thank you so much.
Wish you the best with the rest of it.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. We really